The wine-dark sea stretches endlessly beneath a bronze sky, and somewhere between the churning waves and the rocky shores of islands, whose names have changed 100 times since antiquity, there exists a shadow of a man whose story has been told so many times that the truth has become indistinguishable from the embroidery of centuries. We call him Odysseus, but that name itself is a construction, a Hellenization of something older, something that might have been Odysseus or Utis in the tongue of the Mycenaean scribes who marked their Linear B tablets with the meticulous accounting of palace bureaucracies that cared more for grain stores and bronze ingots than for the tales of wandering kings. To understand the real man beneath the myth, we must first descend into the world that created him, a world of ash and blood and desperate survival at the tail end of the Bronze Age, when the great palatial civilizations of the Aegean were teetering on the edge of catastrophic collapse. The 13th century before the Common Era was a time when the Mediterranean basin hummed with a complex network of trade, diplomacy, and seasonal warfare that connected the Hittite Empire in Anatolia to the pharaonic courts of Egypt, from the merchant princes of Ugarit to the fortress palaces of Mycenaean Greece. These were not the marble temples of classical Athens that would rise centuries later. These were cyclopean fortresses with walls so massive that later Greeks would believe only giants could have built them. Centres of redistributive economies where scribes tracked every jar of oil, every bronze arrowhead, every bolt of linen with obsessive precision. In this world, a petty king ruled not through democratic assemblies or philosophical governance, but through his ability to command warriors, to forge alliances through marriage and gift exchange, and to demonstrate his worth through acts of cunning and controlled violence that maintained his position in a hierarchy that was always contested, always precarious. Ithaca, if we can locate it with any certainty among the Ionian Islands, was not the romantic rocky outcrop of later imagination, but a small, relatively poor kingdom that controlled limited agricultural land and depended heavily on maritime activities for its wealth and prestige. The archaeological record of the Late Bronze Age in the Ionian Islands is sparse, suggesting these were indeed peripheral territories compared to the great centres like Mycenae, Tiryns or Pylos. But this peripherality is itself significant. A ruler of such a place would have been acutely aware of his marginal status, constantly needing to assert his position among the greater kings, constantly navigating the dangerous waters of alliance politics where a misstep could mean annihilation. This context breeds a particular kind of intelligence, not the straightforward heroic valour of an Achilles born to supremacy, but the sideways thinking of a man who must win through wit because he cannot overwhelm through sheer force. The historical kernel that might lie beneath the Odyssey narrative likely begins not with the Trojan War itself, but with the complex political situation that led Mycenaean Greeks to launch what was essentially a massive raiding expedition against the wealthy trading city of Wilusa, which we know from Hittite records existed in northwestern Anatolia in precisely the region later tradition would place Troy. The reasons for such an expedition would have been economic and political rather than the romantic abduction of a single woman, no matter how beautiful. The Late Bronze Age was characterised by what modern historians call the International Age, where great powers maintained a delicate balance through marriage alliances, gift exchanges, and carefully worded diplomatic correspondence preserved on clay tablets. But beneath this veneer of civilization ran constant competition for control of trade routes, access to tin and copper necessary for bronze production, and the prestige goods that legitimised royal power. Wilusa, if it was indeed the historical Troy, sat at the entrance to the Dardanelles, controlling access to the Black Sea trade routes that brought grain, timber and metals from the north. Any disruption to the flow of these goods would have had cascading effects throughout the Aegean, and a coalition of Mycenaean kings would have had strong incentive to either bring Wilusa under their influence or to neutralise it as a commercial competitor. The gathering of this coalition would have required months or years of negotiation, exchanges of embassies, the offering of gifts and the making of promises, and in this process a clever peripheral king could make himself indispensable, not through military might, but through his ability to persuade, to mediate between competing interests, to find the words that would bring reluctant allies to the table. This is where a historical Odysseus would have first demonstrated the qualities that would later be mythologized as divine cunning. The expedition itself, if it occurred, would have been nothing like the neat 10-year siege of epic poetry, but rather a series of seasonal raiding campaigns interspersed with returns home for planting and harvest, a pattern well attested in Bronze Age warfare. Warriors would sail in the spring when seas were calm, establish temporary camps on hostile shores, conduct raids for cattle and captives and portable wealth, and return before the autumn storms made navigation too dangerous. Some contingents might maintain a more permanent presence, building fortifications and attempting to starve out the defenders of the walled citadel. But the archaeological evidence from Troy Therfan, the layer most often identified with the Trojan War, shows a city destroyed by fire and violence around 1180 BCE, during the general period of upheaval that saw the collapse of the entire Bronze Age system. The destruction was thorough, but whether it came from Greek raiders, from internal conflict, from the mysterious sea peoples who were ravaging the eastern Mediterranean, or from some combination of these factors, remains uncertain. What we can say with confidence is that any warrior who participated in such campaigns and survived to return home would have been changed by the experience, traumatized in ways that Bronze Age culture had no vocabulary to express, except through the language of divine intervention and monstrous encounters. The journey home across the Mediterranean in small oar-powered vessels that hugged coastlines and island-hopped was genuinely perilous, subject to sudden storms, navigational errors, and the very real threat of piracy or hostile encounters with coastal populations who had no reason to welcome armed foreigners. A voyage that should have taken weeks could easily extend to months or years if ships were scattered by storms, if contingents became separated, if supplies ran low and forced detours to raid for provisions, or to work as mercenaries for foreign kings in exchange for food and safe passage. The Mediterranean of this period was entering a dark age, though those living through it could not have known the extent of the catastrophe that was unfolding around them. Within a span of perhaps 50 years, virtually every major palatial centre in the Aegean and the Near East was destroyed, from Mycenae to Pylos, from Ugarit to Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite Empire. Trade networks collapsed, literacy disappeared in most regions, population levels plummeted, and the complex hierarchical societies of the palace economies fragmented into smaller, more mobile groups. The causes of this Bronze Age collapse remain debated, with theories ranging from climate change and drought to systems collapse, triggered by over-specialized economies, from invasions by the mysterious sea peoples to internal rebellions by oppressed underclasses. But the result was a Mediterranean world transformed into something far more dangerous and unpredictable than it had been when the warriors first sailed for Troy. A historical Odysseus, attempting to navigate home through this disintegrating world, would have encountered not mythical monsters but the very real horrors of civilizational collapse. Coastal cities burning, refugees fleeing by sea, former allies turned pirate, trade routes abandoned, and the certain knowledge that the world he had left behind no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The psychological weight of this realization, that there might be no stable home to return to, that the palace hierarchies and ritual calendars and social structures that had given life meaning were crumbling, would have been crushing. Small wonder that the survivors of this period, when they or their descendants finally began to tell stories again, would transform their experiences into encounters with divine beings and supernatural threats, because the mundane reality of watching an entire civilization die was perhaps too terrible to speak of directly. The figure who would become Odysseus in later tradition was likely a composite, drawing on the experiences and reputations of multiple historical individuals who lived through this turbulent period. But at the core of the tradition there may have been an actual petty king of Ithaca or a similar island, a man known for his intelligence and his ability to survive where others perished. The qualities attributed to him in the Homeric poems, cunning intelligence, facility with words, ability to adopt disguises and tell convincing lies, willingness to endure shame and degradation in pursuit of larger goals, these are precisely the qualities that would have enabled survival in a collapsing world, where the old heroic values of straightforward combat and open competition had become deadly liabilities. Consider the famous episode of the Trojan Horse, which in mythic terms is presented as a clever stratagem to breach impregnable walls, but which might preserve a memory of something more ambiguous and morally complex. In the brutal pragmatics of Bronze Age warfare, cities were taken through siege, starvation, treachery from within, or by exploiting religious festivals when gates might be opened for ritual purposes. A horse might have been siege equipment, a covered battering ram or a siege tower that later generations no longer recognised and transformed into a literal wooden horse, or it might have been a ruse involving a religious dedication, a massive offering ostensibly left for the gods that actually concealed armed men. The crucial element is the deception, the willingness to use sacred symbols for military purposes, to lie in service of victory. And this would have been controversial even in its own time because Bronze Age warfare, for all its brutality, operated within certain ritual parameters that maintained cosmic order. By violating these parameters, by introducing treachery into what should have been governed by divine will expressed through combat, the perpetrators would have been seen as dangerous, as people who put results above proper relationship with the gods. And this moral ambiguity clings to the figure of Odysseus throughout the tradition. He is never simply a hero in the way Achilles is a hero. He's always complicated, always suspect, always the man who wins through tricks rather than through the straightforward application of courage and strength. This characterization likely reflects real tensions in Bronze Age society between different models of leadership, between the old warrior aristocracy that proved its worth through direct combat and a newer class of administrators and diplomats who wielded power through literacy, bureaucracy, and manipulation of symbolic capital. The journey home, stripped of its supernatural elements, becomes a study in survival against impossible odds in a hostile environment. Mediterranean navigation in the late Bronze Age relied on coastal sailing, landmark recognition, knowledge of seasonal winds and currents, and the ability to read weather signs in sky and sea. A small fleet scattered by storm could easily become lost, driven off course by winds into unknown waters, forced to make landfall on hostile shores where the local population, themselves struggling with the effects of widespread systemic collapse, would view armed strangers as threats to be eliminated or as opportunities for plunder if they appeared weakened. The monsters of the Odyssey may preserve memories of encounters with culturally foreign peoples whose customs seemed barbaric to Greek sensibilities. Transformed through repeated telling into literal man-eaters and witches, the lotus eaters, for instance, might reflect an encounter with a population that used some form of narcotic plant in their religious rituals, something that horrified the Greeks not because it was pleasurable, but because it represented a fundamental challenge to their understanding of proper human life. The loss of desire to return home, to pursue glory, to maintain social bonds. This was a kind of death even if the physical body survived. The Cyclopes, described as lawless beings who live without agriculture or civilization, might preserve memories of encounters with pastoral peoples who rejected the settled, farming life and the hierarchical palace societies that Greeks considered the only proper form of human organization, and the detail that Polyphemus is a shepherd who lives in a cave and knows nothing of wine might reflect real cultural differences between Mycenaean Greeks and indigenous Anatolian or Sicilian populations. The story of blinding the Cyclops and escaping by clinging to the undersides of sheep has the feeling of a folk tale, a trickster narrative that exists in many cultures, but it also encodes a deeper truth about the nature of the intelligence attributed to Odysseus. When he tells Polyphemus that his name is Nobody, he is engaging in a kind of verbal magic, using the slippery nature of language itself as a weapon, exploiting the gap between signifier and signified in a way that demonstrates sophisticated linguistic consciousness. This is the cunning of a literate or semi-literate culture that has become aware of how words can be manipulated, how truth can be technically maintained while meaning is inverted, and it contrasts sharply with the straightforward speech of the heroic warrior who says what he means and means what he says. Yet Odysseus cannot maintain this anonymity. After escaping, he shouts back his real name, his lineage, his home, in a reassertion of heroic identity that immediately brings disaster in the form of Poseidon's curse. This tension between the need to be clever, to survive through deception, and the abandonment of heroic self-presentation, and the equally powerful need to be recognized, to have one's deeds acknowledged, to maintain social identity through public reputation runs throughout the entire tradition and may reflect a genuine psychological and cultural conflict experienced by Bronze Age warriors navigating between different value systems and different modes of being in the world. The encounter with Aeolus, Keeper of the Winds, might preserve a memory of attempting to obtain navigational information from a coastal king or community known for their meteorological knowledge, wisdom about seasonal wind patterns that could be the difference between successful voyage and disaster. The detail that Aeolus gives Odysseus all the contrary winds tied up in a bag, which the crew then opens out of curiosity and greed, reverting them back to where they started, has the quality of a cautionary tale about the breakdown of discipline and trust within the expedition, about how the social bonds that held the warband together during the campaign began to fray during the long, difficult journey home when resources grew scarce and uncertainty eroded the authority of leadership. By the time the wanderers reached the Laestrygonians, described as giant cannibals who destroy all but one of Odysseus's ships by hurling boulders from cliffs, the narrative has entered a space of pure trauma, of experiences so devastating that they can only be processed through mythic transformation. If there is historical memory here, it might be of a catastrophic ambush, of ships trapped in a narrow harbour and destroyed by a hostile population using the terrain to their advantage, of watching companions die in large numbers and being helpless to prevent it, of the survivor's guilt that comes from being the one who escapes when so many others perish. The reduction of the fleet from 12 ships to 1, of hundreds of men to a few dozen, marks a descent into a darker phase of the journey, where survival becomes increasingly desperate and the possibility of return increasingly remote. Circe's island presents a different kind of danger, not the immediate physical threat of monsters or storms, but the more insidious threat of forgetting the very purpose of the journey, of becoming content in a pleasant captivity that offers food and sexual pleasure and the cessation of struggle. The detail that Circe transforms men into pigs might preserve a memory of degradation, of men who abandon their warrior identity and live like animals, concerned only with feeding and basic appetites, or it might reflect anxieties about foreign women and their dangerous powers, about the vulnerability of Greek warriors to the seductions of the East, to luxury and softness that unmans them and makes return to the harsh realities of home impossible. The intervention of Hermes, who gives Odysseus the magical herb Amole that protects him from Circe's magic, is clearly mythological, but it might stand in for some kind of knowledge, some cultural or ritual immunity that allows the hero to navigate this danger where others succumb. That Odysseus remains with Circe for a full year, even after his men are restored, suggests the powerful appeal of this alternative to the difficult journey home. And when they finally do leave, it is at the men's insistence rather than the hero's initiative, a detail that complicates the simple narrative of the man determined to reach home at any cost. The ambivalence here might reflect real conflicts experienced by Bronze Age warriors returning from long campaigns, the difficulty of reintegrating into domestic life, the appeal of the liminal space of travel where one is neither at war nor at home, where normal social obligations are suspended and life takes on a strange unmoored quality. The journey to the underworld, the Nekia, is the emotional and symbolic heart of the wanderings, the moment when the narrative stops moving forward through space and instead descends into the realm of death and memory. Stripped of its supernatural machinery, this episode might represent a moment of profound psychological crisis, a confrontation with the cost of survival, with the weight of all those who did not return. The shades that Odysseus encounters are not random but specific. His mother, who died while he was away, Agamemnon murdered upon his return home by his wife and her lover, Achilles, who chose glory and early death over long life in obscurity, Ajax, who killed himself after being dishonoured in the dispute over Achilles' armour. Each encounter forces Odysseus to confront a different aspect of his own situation and choices, different possible outcomes of his own story. Learning that his mother died from grief at his absence, that she wasted away waiting for a son who never came, confronts him with the human cost of his absence, with the suffering of those left behind who can only wait and hope, and eventually despair. The encounter with Agamemnon, the great king who led the expedition but was murdered ignominiously in his own home, raises the terrifying possibility that return itself might not bring safety, that home might harbour worse dangers than any encountered in travel, that wives who have been left alone for years or decades might not welcome their husband's return but might have made other arrangements, might have moved on in ways that make the returning warrior an intruder in his own house. Achilles' famous declaration that he would rather be a living serf than a dead king, that all the glory in the world means nothing once you are dead, represents a profound challenge to the entire heroic value system that motivated the war in the first place. And coming from Achilles, the ultimate hero who embodied those values most completely, it has devastating force. If even Achilles regrets his choice, if even the man who achieved the greatest glory possible finds it worthless in death, then what justification remains for any of the suffering and loss? What meaning can be salvaged from all the years of war and wandering? Ajax's refusal to speak to Odysseus, his turning away in silent condemnation, carries perhaps the most personal sting because it concerns the hero's own actions, his role in the dispute that led to Ajax's suicide. The tradition held that after Achilles' death, his magnificent armour was to be awarded to the best of the remaining Greeks, and the contest came down to Odysseus and Ajax, with Odysseus winning through persuasive speech where Ajax relied on his combat record. The fact that Odysseus won through words what Ajax deserved through deeds encapsulates the tension between different modes of excellence, and Ajax's suicide in response to this dishonour suggests that for some warriors the old heroic code was so absolute that to be defeated in this way, to have one's worth denied by the community, made life itself impossible. Emerging from this confrontation with death and the past, the wanderers must navigate between Scylla and Charybdis, between the six-headed monster that snatches men from the deck and the whirlpool that can destroy the entire ship. The detail of this geography has led many to identify the location with the Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily, a genuinely dangerous passage with strong currents and whirlpools, but the symbolic meaning transcends any specific location. The choice between evils, the necessity of accepting certain limited loss to avoid total catastrophe, the burden of command that requires a leader to knowingly send men to their deaths for the greater good of the survivors, these are the moral complexities of leadership in extremis, far removed from the clear-cut heroism of the battlefield. The final catastrophe comes at the island of the sun god Helios, where the starving crew, against Odysseus's warnings and against divine prohibition, slaughter and eat the sacred cattle. The historical kernel here might be a desperate act of sacrilege, the violation of a sanctuary or the theft of livestock belonging to a temple, driven by starvation to the point where the fear of divine retribution became less immediate than the physical necessity of food. The destruction of the ship and the death of all the remaining crew, leaving Odysseus as the sole survivor clinging to wreckage, represents the ultimate isolation, the complete stripping away of the social identity of the warrior king who commands men, reducing him to naked survival, to the most basic animal existence. The long years spent on Calypso's island, held captive by a divine nymph who offers immortality and eternal youth if he will only abandon his quest to return home and remain with her, represents a different kind of death, not physical, but ontological. To accept immortality would be to cease being human, to step outside the stream of mortal time where meaning comes from the fact of mortality, from the necessity of making choices that matter because life is finite. The tradition holds that Odysseus refuses, that he sits on the beach weeping and staring at the sea, longing for home despite having everything the world could offer in terms of pleasure and security. And this refusal is presented as the defining characteristic of his humanity. But we might also see in this image of a man trapped for 7 years on a beautiful island with a divine lover, weeping for home, a portrait of traumatic dissociation, of a person who survives physically, but who has become disconnected from his own life, unable to move forward or backward, caught in a static present that offers no meaning because it offers no possibility of change or growth. The intervention of Athena and the other gods that finally secures his release might stand in for some internal process of recovery, some mustering of will that allows forward movement again after years of paralysis. The final stage of the journey, the shipwreck on Phaeacia and the encounter with the utopian kingdom of Alcinous, provides a transition between the world of wandering and the harsh realities of return. The Phaeacians live in a kind of paradise, protected from war and hardship, devoted to peaceful pursuits, and they possess magical ships that can navigate without human guidance, that know the way to all destinations. This fantasy of effortless travel, after years of deadly navigation through hostile seas, has obvious appeal, but the Phaeacians are also explicitly marginal to normal human society, living at the edge of the world, neither fully mortal nor divine, and their function in the narrative is to restore Odysseus to himself, to provide the audience that will hear his story and the conveyance that will finally bring him home. The long flashback in which Odysseus narrates his own wanderings to the Phaeacian court is structurally significant because it raises questions about reliability and self-presentation. We hear these adventures not from an omniscient narrator, but from Odysseus himself, who has already been characterized as a skilled liar, a master of persuasive speech, telling his story to an audience from whom he wants safe passage and rich gifts. How much of what he tells them is true, and how much is shaped by the rhetorical situation, by the need to present himself in a particular light? The frame narrative does not answer this question, but rather holds it open, asking us to consider how all stories, especially stories of survival and heroism, are shaped by the context in which they are told and the purposes they serve. Return to Ithaca brings not resolution, but new complications, because the home that Odysseus left no longer exists except as a memory, and the man who returns is not the same man who left. 20 years have passed, a full generation, and in that time the palace has been overrun by suitors pressing Penelope to accept that Odysseus is dead and to choose a new husband from among them. These suitors are not simply villains, but representatives of a younger generation that has no memory of Odysseus's rule, that knows the war only as stories told by old men, and that has legitimate interests in the succession crisis created by the king's long absence. In the power vacuum created by Odysseus's absence, different factions have emerged with competing claims and interests, and his sudden return threatens to upset arrangements that have been decades in the making. The tradition presents Penelope as the faithful wife who resists all pressure to remarry, who maintains her loyalty through elaborate stratagems like weaving and unweaving the funeral shroud for Odysseus's father Laertes. But even she is presented ambiguously. She has clearly enjoyed the attention of the suitors to some degree, has allowed the situation to continue far longer than would have been necessary if she truly wanted to end it. And when Odysseus returns in disguise, she does not immediately recognize him, or perhaps, more disturbingly, does recognize him, but continues to test and manipulate the situation to her own advantage. The question of what Penelope knew, and when she knew it, whether her recognition scenes are genuine or performed, has troubled readers for millennia, and may reflect genuine ambiguities in the tradition about the relationship between husband and wife after such long separation. Odysseus's approach to reclaiming his home is characteristic of his method throughout. He does not announce himself openly and attempt to assert his rights through direct confrontation, but rather enters in disguise as a beggar, the lowest and most despised social position, and from this position of apparent powerlessness he gathers intelligence, tests loyalties, and prepares his revenge. The ability to endure insult and physical abuse without revealing himself, to be beaten and mocked and remain in character, demonstrates a kind of self-control that would have been deeply foreign to traditional heroic psychology, which demanded immediate retaliation for any slight to honour. The willingness to strategically accept shame for tactical advantage marks Odysseus as a new kind of figure, and the tradition seems unsure whether to admire this, or to find it somehow unsavoury, a violation of proper heroic conduct. The great bow that only Odysseus can string becomes the test of identity, the physical proof that overrides all questions of appearance and verbal claims, and when he finally reveals himself by stringing the bow and shooting through the axe handles, the violence that follows is absolute and merciless. The slaughter of the suitors is described in gruesome detail, with Odysseus and his son Telemachus and a few loyal servants systematically killing over 100 men trapped in the hall, shooting them down with arrows and then finishing the wounded with spears and swords, and afterward they execute the serving women who had slept with the suitors, hanging them in a row so that their feet kick and twitch, but not for long. This mass killing poses profound problems for any attempt to see Odysseus as a straightforward hero, because it is not combat between equals, but the methodical slaughter of trapped men who cannot effectively fight back. And the execution of the women is even more troubling because their crime was sleeping with men they had every reason to believe were legitimate suitors in a household where the master was presumed dead. The tradition attempts to justify this violence by characterizing the suitors as overreaching and impious, as consuming Odysseus's wealth without right, and pressuring Penelope improperly. But the scale of the slaughter and the calculated nature of it, the way Odysseus plans and executes it without mercy or second thoughts, reveals something darker about the character and about the world that produced him. From a historical perspective, this homecoming violence likely reflects real patterns of succession crisis and power struggle in Bronze Age palace societies, where long absences by rulers created opportunities for rivals to make claims on power and resources, and where the return of the legitimate ruler would necessitate violent reassertion of authority and elimination of competitors. The suitors represent not just personal rivals for Penelope, but political factions that have formed around different possible futures for Ithaca, and their elimination is necessary not from personal revenge but from political survival, to prevent civil war and to re-establish undisputed authority. The brutality of the reconsolidation of power, including the execution of servants and slaves who sided with the wrong faction, would have been understood as necessary ruthlessness rather than criminal excess in a world where power was maintained through demonstrated capacity for violence. The final recognition scene between Odysseus and Penelope is famous for its complexity and its refusal of simple romantic reunion. Even after the slaughter of the suitors, even after Odysseus has proven his identity through the bow and through the scar on his leg that the old nurse recognizes, Penelope remains skeptical, tests him one final time by pretending that she has moved their marriage bed, which Odysseus himself built around a living olive tree that formed one of its posts. Only when Odysseus reacts with intimate knowledge of this secret, known only to the two of them and one trusted servant, does Penelope accept him, and the detail of the olive tree, the living wood incorporated into human construction, rooted in the earth and yet shaped by craft, becomes a powerful symbol of the marriage itself, of something organic that has been made into culture but retains its connection to nature. Yet even this reunion is shadowed by the knowledge that it cannot last, because Odysseus has already learned from the prophet Tiresias in the underworld that he must undertake one final journey, that he must travel inland carrying an oar until he reaches people who have never seen the sea, who mistake the oar for a winnowing fan, and there plant the oar in the earth and make sacrifice to Poseidon, and only then can he return home to age peacefully and die a gentle death far from the sea. This prophecy of further wandering, of a future that cannot settle into domestic stability even after return, suggests that the experience of the journey has marked Odysseus in ways that make true homecoming impossible, that he has become a figure defined by movement and displacement, by the liminal space between places rather than by belonging to any particular place. The historical Odysseus, if such a person existed, was likely a minor Mycenaean king or warlord who participated in raiding campaigns in Anatolia during the final decades of the Bronze Age, and who survived the long period of chaos and collapse that followed to return eventually to his home island. Though what he found there and what became of him, we cannot know. The qualities attributed to him in the tradition — intelligence, cunning, facility with language, willingness to use deception, ability to endure hardship and humiliation, ruthlessness in the pursuit of survival and the restoration of power — these are precisely the qualities that would have been valuable during the Bronze Age collapse, when the old certainties of palace bureaucracies and ritual calendars and heroic combat between aristocratic warriors were swept away and replaced by a much harsher world where survival depended on adaptability, on the willingness to abandon old modes of being and to become something new. The transformation of this historical figure or figures into the mythic Odysseus occurred over centuries of oral tradition, with countless bards shaping and reshaping the story, adding elements from folklore and religious myth, from other hero traditions, from the lived experiences of later generations of sailors and travellers, until the historical kernel, if it ever existed, became almost impossible to extract from the accretions of story. By the time the Odyssey was composed, probably in the 8th century BCE, some 400 years after the events it purports to describe, the Bronze Age world had been forgotten, replaced by the very different society of the early Iron Age, and the bard or bards who gave the poem its final form were not attempting to preserve historical memory, but to create a story that would speak to their own time, that would address the concerns and anxieties of 8th century Greeks, using the distant past as a kind of mythic space where these issues could be explored. Yet something authentic survived the transformation, some genuine Bronze Age memory embedded in the details of the story, in the catalogue of ships that preserves a political geography that matches what we know of Mycenaean Greece, in the descriptions of material culture that include objects like the boar's tusk helmet that had not existed for centuries when the poem was composed, in the general outline of a world of palace kingdoms connected by maritime trade and seasonal warfare that corresponds to what archaeology has revealed about the late Bronze Age. More subtly, the character of Odysseus himself, with his mixture of heroic and anti-heroic qualities, his representative status as a man caught between different value systems and different modes of being, may preserve something of the psychological reality of living through the collapse, of being shaped by a world that was dying and having to find ways to survive in the world that was being born. The brutality beneath the myth is not the spectacular violence of combat, which the epic tradition celebrates openly, but the quieter, more corrosive brutality of survival in a collapsing civilization, of making choices that compromise every value you were raised to hold sacred because the alternative is death, or oblivion, of becoming a person you would not recognize in order to remain alive, of carrying the weight of all those who did not survive and trying to find some meaning in your survival that does not reduce to simple luck or to moral failure. This is the brutality of the returning veteran who finds that home has become foreign, that the people he left behind have become strangers, that the person he was before the war no longer exists and cannot be recovered, that the only way forward is through violence that will solve nothing but will at least impose a temporary order on chaos. The real Odysseus, then, is not a person but a problem, not a historical individual but a nexus of tensions and contradictions that the Bronze Age collapse brought into being and that Greek culture continued to wrestle with for centuries. The tension between individual survival and communal values, between intelligence and honour, between the necessity of deception and the ideal of truthful speech, between the hero as warrior and the hero as survivor, between the home as destination and the home as trap, between the journey as hardship and the journey as the only authentic mode of existence for a person who has been changed too profoundly to ever truly return. These tensions were not resolved in the myth, and could not be resolved because they reflected real contradictions in the historical experience that generated the tradition. Contradictions that continue to resonate wherever people confront the consequences of catastrophic social change, of violent displacement, of the gap between the world as it was and the world as it has become. To understand the real Odysseus is to understand that heroism is not always glorious, that survival is not always noble, that the qualities that allow a person or a people to endure catastrophe are not always the qualities that make for admirable character, that there is often a profound moral cost to doing what must be done to persist through dark times, and that the stories we tell about these experiences, the myths we construct to make sense of senseless suffering and loss, are simultaneously revelations and concealments, both preserving memory and transforming it into something we can bear to contemplate. The wine-dark sea continues to conceal its secrets, and the rocky shores of Ithaca, whichever island it might be, offer no certain answers, only the endless whisper of waves against stone, the sound that has outlasted empires and stories both, the sound that continues whether anyone is there to hear it or not, indifferent to human meaning and human suffering, the eternal backdrop against which the small dramas of mortal lives are played out and forgotten, and sometimes, if the conditions are right, remembered in forms so changed that truth and fiction become indistinguishable, leaving us only with the story itself, which must be enough.